Welcome to Motivational Humanity. You are not alone.
You woke up tired again. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes. Not the kind that a cup of coffee and a brisk walk can chase away. This is something deeper, something that lives in your chest like a stone you've been carrying so long you've forgotten what it felt like to set it down. You move through your mornings, you make the coffee, you check the phone, you smile when you're supposed to. And somewhere in the middle of all that motion, a quiet, desperate question surfaces. Why am I this exhausted when I haven't even done anything yet? That question right there is the one I want to sit with you inside today. Because if you felt it, and I think you have, or you wouldn't be here, then what you're experiencing has a name. It's called emotional drain. And it's one of the most misunderstood, most invisible, most dismissed forms of suffering that women like us carry. I say, woman like us, because I want you to hear that this isn't a clinical monologue from someone peering at you through a professional lens. I've been in that tired place. I know what it feels like to pour yourself into everyone around you. Your children, your partner, your friends, your aging parents, your colleagues, and then stand alone in a quiet room and realize there's almost nothing left. I know what it feels like to wonder if something is wrong with you. To wonder if you're weak or ungrateful or broken in some way you can't quite see. You're not broken. But something is happening, and it deserves to be spoken aloud. Emotional drain doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't arrive at your door with a letter of intent. It sneaks in slowly, the way a cold draft finds the gaps in an old house. At first, you just feel a little off, a little flatter than usual. You stop looking forward to things you used to love. The phone call with your daughter, Sunday dinners, even just reading in the evenings. Your inner sanctuary, that private place inside you where you used to feel like yourself, starts to feel distant. Like you've misplaced the key. Then come the small signs you wave away. You snap at someone you love and immediately feel a crushing guilt. You say, I'm fine. So automatically you're not even sure you checked first. You find yourself sitting in your car before going inside. Just sitting there, engine off, buying a few more minutes of solitude before the demands begin again. That parking lot, that driveway, that 2-minute walk from the mailbox. Those stolen moments are telling you something. They're your nervous system whispering, I need a break I never get to take. And here is one of the great unspoken truths about emotional drain for women who came of age the way we did. We were never taught to name it. We were taught to manage it. Push through it. Pray through it, laugh it off at book club. We were handed the quiet heroism of endurance as if it were a virtue, and most of us wore it faithfully for decades. We kept houses and kept peace and kept everyone else's emotional temperature regulated. And nobody, almost nobody, ever pulled us aside and said, you matter too. Your depletion is real. Your exhaustion is data, not weakness. So here we are. And I want you to feel right now that what you've been carrying is real. It is not in your head. It is not a character flaw wrapped in self-pity. Emotional drain is what happens when a human being, a feeling, loving, complex human being, gives and gives and gives without ever truly receiving, without ever truly resting, without ever being asked, with genuine curiosity, how they are doing. There's a particular kind of woman who ends up emotionally drained, and she's remarkable. She's the one people call when things fall apart. She's the one who remembers birthdays and notices when someone seems quieter than usual and always shows up. She keeps the peace when it would be easier to cause a scene. She holds the family's grief and the family's logistics and the family's history all at the same time. Like she's carrying 3 bags of groceries with no cart and somehow still holding the door open for everyone else. Does that sound like anyone you know? The weight we carry as women in our 50s, 60s, and 70s is unlike anything else. Because by this point in life, we've accumulated layers of responsibility and loss and love that don't just evaporate when our children grow or our careers wind down. Sometimes the demands actually intensify. Parents who need care, marriages that require tending, adult children with their own crises, grandchildren, grief that keeps arriving in waves, for people we've lost, for versions of ourselves we thought we'd be, for the life that moved faster than we expected. And through all of it, the question we almost never stop to ask ourselves, who is holding me? That question isn't self-pity. That is one of the most important, most urgent, most sacred questions you can ask at this stage of your life. Because emotional drain, left unnamed and unaddressed, doesn't stay quiet. It doesn't just make you tired. Over time, it reshapes you. It dims the colors of your life. It makes joy feel effortful. It pulls you away from the present moment because the present moment keeps asking more of you than you have left to give. And the cruelest part, women who are emotionally drained often look, from the outside, like they're doing just fine. Because they've gotten so good at functioning through the depletion. So skilled at performing okay when they're anything but. I want you to give yourself permission, right now, in this moment, to stop performing. You don't have to be okay in this conversation. You don't have to frame your exhaustion as something you're working on or managing well. You can just let it be what it is, real and heavy and worth taking seriously. What we're going to explore together isn't a list of self-care tips or a cheerful action plan. It goes deeper than that. We're going to look at why the drain happens, the invisible forces and quiet bargains and old stories that keep so many of us locked in the cycle of giving until we're empty. We're going to name the unspoken truths that don't get said at the dinner table or in the doctor's office or even between the closest of friends. And then, slowly, gently, we're going to talk about what it looks like to come back to yourself. Not as a project, not as an overhaul, as a homecoming. Because that woman who once felt like herself, she hasn't left. She's just been waiting under all that weight for someone to finally ask how she's doing. So, how are you doing, really? Part 2, THEINVCLEFARCSDRA and YUDRY. Let's talk about something nobody puts on the list. When people talk about burnout, and they do talk about it now more than they used to, they tend to point at the obvious culprits. Too much to do, not enough sleep, overcommitted schedules. And yes, those things are real. But for women in this season of life, the drain rarely comes from just being busy. Busy you can manage. Busy you've managed your entire life. No. What drains women like you goes far beneath the schedule. It lives in the architecture of your relationships. It hides inside the roles you've played for so long you've forgotten their roles. It breathes inside the unspoken agreements you made years ago. Some consciously, most not, about who you were supposed to be, what you were supposed to need, and how much space you were allowed to take up. These are the invisible forces. And until you can see them clearly, they'll keep running the show. The first one, and this one I want you to sit with, is something I call chronic emotional labor without reciprocity. Emotional labor is the invisible work of managing not just your own feelings, but everyone else's. It's reading the room at Christmas dinner so nobody fights. It's knowing your son needs a call even when he hasn't asked. It's softening bad news, smoothing over tension, asking the follow-up question, noticing the thing that went unsaid. It's empathy as a full-time occupation. And here's the thing about emotional labor, it is genuinely, profoundly loving work. There is something beautiful about a woman who knows how to hold space for people she loves. Don't let anyone take that from you. But there's a quiet crisis hiding inside that beauty, and it's this emotional labor is exhausting when it only flows in one direction. Think about the relationships in your life right now. Not how they look on a good day, how they function on an ordinary one. Who reaches out to check on you? Who notices when you seem a little off? Who asks a question and then actually waits patiently for the real answer? Not just the, "I'm fine" answer? Who holds your feelings with the same care and attention you bring to theirs? For many women I've spoken with and sat across from in my work, that list is heartbreakingly short. Not because the people in their lives are bad people. Most of them aren't. But there's a painful dynamic that develops when you're very good at being the emotional anchor. People stop thinking you need anchoring. You become, in everyone else's mind, the stable one, the strong one. And so the care just doesn't travel back in your direction. Not because it's deliberately withheld. Because it never occurs to anyone that you might need it. That gap between how much you give and how little flows back is one of the deepest wells of emotional drain there is. And it is silent. It doesn't show up in any conversation. Nobody meant for it to happen this way. But here you are, giving from a well that nobody ever refills, and wondering why you feel so impossibly dry. The second invisible force is one most women recognize the moment they hear it named: even if they've never had words for it before. The cost of keeping the peace. How much of your energy goes, every single day, toward managing conflict that never actually gets resolved, toward swallowing words that needed to be said, toward smoothing things over instead of working things through, toward being the person who bends again so that the relationship doesn't break? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from years of that. It's not the exhaustion of a hard conversation. It's the exhaustion of 1,000 conversations that never happened. Words held in the body take up space. Grief that doesn't get voiced finds somewhere else to live, in tension headaches, in sleepless nights, in the low, persistent ache of feeling unseen. So many women I've known were taught, explicitly or by example, that their comfort with conflict was a measure of their character. That a good woman keeps the peace. That love means accommodation. That if you push back, you're difficult. If you say no, you're selfish. If you name what's hurting you, you're stirring the pot. And so you learn to stir quietly, if at all. You learn to feel the hurt and then tuck it somewhere tidy. You became extraordinarily skilled at carrying pain gracefully. And the world rewarded you for it. Told you were strong, you were generous, you were the glue that held everything together. But nobody told you the price. The price is this: every time you silence yourself to preserve someone else's comfort, a small piece of your energy goes with the unexpressed truth. You don't just lose the words. You lose a little bit of yourself. And over a lifetime of doing this, over decades of choosing harmony over honesty, the losses accumulate into something that feels, from the inside, like a kind of quiet disappearance. You're still there. You're still showing up. But somewhere along the way, the version of you who had opinions and fire and needs and edges, she got softened into someone more manageable. And that process, even when it was chosen with love, is its own kind of loss. One worth grieving. The third force is the one that surprises people most, because it looks, on the surface, like something good. It's identity fusion. When who you are has become so thoroughly intertwined with who you are for others that you've quietly lost track of where they end and you begin. This happens gradually. It happened to most of us so slowly we didn't notice. You became a mother, and motherhood was all-consuming and magnificent, and it asked for everything. And you gave everything because that's what love does. You were a wife, a daughter, a caretaker, a colleague, a friend. And each of those roles asked something of you, and you answered each calling faithfully. And one day, when the house got quieter, or the career shifted, or the children left, or loss arrived, you sat with yourself in an unfamiliar silence and thought, I don't know who I am when I'm not needed. That thought, right there. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have. The discovery that the self you built was almost entirely relational, defined by function, by usefulness, by what you could provide. And without the providing, there's a bewildering emptiness, not because you're hollow, but because the habit of being for others ran so deep, for so long, that the habit of simply being, existing for your own sake, taking up space because you are worth space, never fully got to develop. This is not a character flaw. I want to say that clearly. Identity fusion in women of your generation wasn't an accident or a weakness. It was, in many ways, the water you swam in, the culture you were handed, the model you were shown. Women who centered themselves were called selfish. Women who asked for more were called demanding. And so most of you learned very early to want less, to need quietly, to exist in the margins of your own lives while keeping everyone else comfortably centered. But here is what I know. After years of sitting with women navigating this exact terrain, the self doesn't disappear, it waits. And when you start, gently, tentatively, to ask what you want, what you feel, what you need without immediately checking whether it's convenient for everyone else first, something begins to stir, something that felt dormant, something that remembers. There's one more invisible force I want to name before we move forward, because it may be the most insidious of all. It's the internalized belief that your depletion is the price of love. Somewhere, for so many of us, these two things got fused together, being a good woman and running on empty. As if the sacrifice itself were proof of the love. As if needing rest or joy or reciprocity were a kind of betrayal of the people who depend on you. And so you keep pouring, even when the pitcher is dry, Because stopping feels selfish. Because resting feels like abandonment. Because asking for something back feels like keeping score, and keeping score feels cold, and cold feels like the opposite of everything you've ever wanted to be. But here's the quiet whisper I want to leave underneath all of that. You cannot love well from a place of chronic depletion. You simply can't, not fully, not sustainably. The love you give from emptiness is thin and frightened and coated in resentment you're working hard not to feel. The love you give from fullness, from a self that has been tended and honored and genuinely rested. That love is something else entirely. That love is generous without being self-destructive, present without being performative. Real. Your replenishment is not a luxury. It is not a reward you earn after everyone else is okay. It is the very foundation of your capacity to love. And you have been starving that foundation for a very long time. Here's the moment where most conversations about emotional drain take a wrong turn. They move too quickly to the fix. They hand you the breathing exercise, the boundary-setting script, the morning routine that will supposedly change everything. And those things aren't useless. Some of them genuinely help. But if you move to the solution before you fully understand the pattern, you'll find yourself right back in the same place 6 months from now, wondering why nothing has really changed. Because the truth is, and this is something I've learned from years of working with women and from my own hard seasons, the drain doesn't persist because you haven't tried hard enough. It persists because there are patterns underneath it. Deep ones. Ones with roots that go all the way back. And you can't prune a root you've never seen, so let's look. Gently but honestly. The first pattern I want to name is one you might recognize the moment you hear it, even if it makes you a little uncomfortable. It's the helper's identity trap. There's a particular kind of woman, and again, she's remarkable, who has built her sense of self-worth almost entirely around her usefulness to others. She doesn't do this consciously. She doesn't sit down one day and decide, I will only feel valuable when I'm needed. It develops the way most deep patterns do, slowly. Through experience, through reward, through the slow accumulation of messages about what makes a woman worthy of love and belonging. She learned, somewhere along the way, that when she helped, people were warm toward her. When she gave, people smiled. When she made herself available and accommodating and low maintenance, she was called a blessing, a gift, the best kind of friend. And when she had needs of her own, when she was struggling or tired or wanted something, the response was often cooler, less enthusiastic, sometimes even subtly punishing. So she learned to lead with giving. Always. She learned that her needs were a disruption. Her rest was an inconvenience. Her own desires were secondary at best to the comfort of everyone around her. And now, here she is, decades later, still operating from that same unrevised belief system. Still equating her value with her output. Still feeling a deep, almost physical discomfort when she rests, when she says no, when she chooses herself. Because some quiet part of her still believes that a woman who isn't useful isn't worth very much. Does that land anywhere for you? I'm not asking to pry. I'm asking because that belief, that specific silent, devastating belief, is one of the most common roots of chronic emotional drain I've ever encountered. And it will keep feeding the cycle no matter how many self-care tips you try, until it's looked at directly and gently, slowly revised. Your worth is not your output. It never was. You were worthy of rest and care and presence and love on the very first day you arrived in this world, before you had done a single thing for anyone. That truth got buried under a lifetime of messages to the contrary. But it's still true. It was always true. The second pattern is quieter and more painful, and I want to approach it carefully. It's the resentment you're not supposed to feel. Because if you've been giving generously for a long time, if you've been the helper, the anchor, the one who holds things together, there is almost certainly a layer of resentment underneath all that love. And most women carry that resentment the way they carry everything else, quietly, privately, with a great deal of shame about the fact that it exists at all. I shouldn't feel this way. I love them. What kind of person resents the people they love? A depleted one. That's the honest answer. A human one. Resentment is not the opposite of love. Resentment is what love looks like when it's been giving without receiving for too long. It's the emotional equivalent of a muscle that's been working without rest. it doesn't mean the muscle is bad. It means the muscle is exhausted and needs to be heard. The problem with unacknowledged resentment is that it doesn't stay quiet. It leaks. It comes out sideways. In the sharp comment you immediately regret. In the withdrawal that nobody can quite explain. In the tearfulness that ambushes you at unexpected moments. In the slow erosion of warmth toward people you genuinely love. And then comes the guilt. And then comes the effort to compensate for the guilt by giving even more. And the cycle deepens. The way out of that cycle is not to try harder to feel more grateful. That approach, however well-intentioned, is a kind of emotional suppression that solves nothing and costs everything. The way out is to actually acknowledge the resentment. To name it privately and honestly, without immediately apologizing for its existence. I am tired of being the one who always gives. I am tired of my needs being invisible. I am tired of loving people who don't seem to know how to love me back in the ways I need most. You're allowed to feel that. You're allowed to say it, at least to yourself. Not because saying it fixes everything, it doesn't. But because the acknowledgement itself is a form of self-respect. And self-respect, for women who've spent decades in the helper's identity trap, is not a small thing. It's a radical and necessary act. The third pattern is one that will resonate if you've ever been accused of being too sensitive, or told that you take things too personally. It's the pattern of absorbing other people's emotional states as your own. Some women, and this is far more common than most people realize, have a nervous system that's exquisitely tuned to the emotional environment around them. They walk into a room and immediately feel the tension before anyone has spoken. They pick up on subtle shifts in someone's tone and spend the rest of the conversation trying to figure out if they've done something wrong. They carry home the weight of a friend's sadness, a child's worry, a partner's frustration, not out of choice, but because they can't seem to stop the absorption. This is sometimes called being an empath, a word that gets used loosely but points at something real. A kind of emotional porousness that makes the boundary between your feelings and other people's feelings genuinely thin. And it is, in its own way, a gift. Women with this kind of attunement are extraordinary listeners, extraordinarily perceptive, extraordinarily compassionate. But without the skills to protect that permeability, without clear boundaries and deliberate practices of returning to yourself, it becomes one of the most relentless sources of drain imaginable. Because you're not just carrying your own emotional life, you're carrying everyone else's too, all day, every day. Without anyone asking, without anyone noticing, and often without you even fully realizing that what you're feeling isn't entirely yours to begin with. Think about that for a moment. How much of what exhausts you on any given day originated in someone else's emotional world? How much of the anxiety you carry is actually a borrowed anxiety from a loved one's worry? How much of the heaviness is grief or frustration that came home with you from a conversation that was never really about you? Learning to feel the distinction. This is mine. This belongs to them is one of the most liberating skills a woman like you can develop. Not so you stop caring. Never that. But so you stop dissolving into other people's experiences, losing yourself entirely in the process. Your inner world deserves to be protected. Your emotional landscape deserves a boundary at its edge. Not a wall, not a coldness, but a gentle, firm threshold that says, I can care about you without disappearing into you. There's a fourth pattern, and it's the one that keeps all the others in place. It's the fear of what happens if you actually change. This one doesn't get talked about enough. Because we spend a lot of time talking about wanting to break out of these cycles, wanting to stop the drain, wanting to live differently. But underneath that genuine desire, there's often a quieter, more complicated layer of fear. What if I set a limit and the relationship can't survive it? What if I stop being endlessly available and people stop needing me? What if I take up space and discover that when I'm not being useful, I don't know who I am? What if I choose myself and the people I love feel abandoned? These fears are not irrational. They come from real experience. You have probably seen at some point in your life what happens when a woman decides she's done being endlessly accommodating. The social cost can be real. The relationship friction can be real. Change, even healthy change, often creates turbulence before it creates peace. But here's what I want you to sit with: the cost of not changing is also real. It's just quieter. It's the slow erosion of your joy. It's the gradual dimming of your energy. It's the particular sadness of a woman who wakes up in her 60s or 70s and realizes she spent the most vibrant decades of her life holding everyone else up while never once asking to be held herself. That cost is real. It's just paid in a currency that's invisible, in unlived moments, unexpressed truths, unrealized versions of yourself. The fear of change is understandable. It makes complete sense given everything you've carried and everything you've been taught. But it is not the final word. And the fact that you're still here, still listening, still willing to look honestly at these patterns, that tells me something important about you. You haven't given up on yourself. Not entirely. Even in the exhaustion, even under all that weight, some part of you is still reaching towards something better. That reaching matters. Hold on to it. Because what comes next is not another list of what's wrong with your life. What comes next is about returning to yourself, to your own voice, to the kind of quiet, grounded aliveness that you may not have felt in a very long time. It won't be a dramatic transformation. The most real and lasting kind of healing rarely is. It's slower than that, gentler. More like a long, careful walk home than a sudden arrival. But you've been finding your way back from hard places before. And you know how to walk. There is no perfect ending to a story like this. No moment where the exhaustion lifts all at once, where the relationships suddenly become reciprocal, where the old patterns dissolve overnight, and you wake up feeling entirely like yourself again. Anyone who promises you that is selling something, and I want no part of that transaction. What I can offer you is something more durable than a promise. I can offer you a direction, a way of moving through your days that gradually, quietly, begins to shift the weight. Not by removing everything that's heavy. Some of it belongs in your life, and you know the difference. But by making sure that for the first time, perhaps in a very long time, you are also on your own list. Not at the bottom, not as an afterthought. On the list, present, counted, real. The first thing, and I want to say this as plainly as I know how, is that you have to begin telling the truth to yourself. Not to everyone, not all at once. Just to yourself in the privacy of your own honest inner conversation. Because so much of what keeps the drain going is the story we tell ourselves about our own experience. The story that says it's not that bad. The story that says other people have it worse. The story that says I'm fine, I just need to push through. Those stories are kindly meant. They come from a place of trying to cope. Trying to keep going, trying not to be a burden. But they are also a form of self-abandonment. Every time you tell yourself you're fine when you're not, you are, in a very real sense, leaving yourself alone with your pain, and you have been alone with it long enough. So the practice, and I use that word deliberately, because it is a practice, something you do imperfectly and repeatedly, is to begin checking in with yourself with the same genuine curiosity you extend to the people you love. Not a performative check-in, not a quick scan followed by I'm fine, moving on. A real one. How am I actually doing right now? What am I carrying that doesn't belong to me? What do I need today that I haven't given myself permission to ask for? Those questions, asked honestly and regularly, begin to rebuild something that years of drain erode. The relationship you have with yourself. And that relationship, with your own inner life, your own needs, your own truth, is the foundation everything else rests on. You cannot build reciprocity in your outer relationships until you begin practicing reciprocity with yourself. The second movement is one that requires courage, and I won't pretend otherwise. It's the slow, imperfect, necessary work of letting your needs become visible. Not in a way that floods everyone around you. Not in a torrent of everything you've held back for years. That rarely goes well, and it isn't what I'm suggesting. But in small, consistent, real ways. Beginning to say, out loud, things that you have previously only thought in the privacy of your exhaustion. I'm struggling a little right now. I could use some help with this. I need tonight to be quiet. That hurt me, and I want you to know. These sentences feel enormous when you're not used to saying them. They can feel selfish, or dramatic, or risky. But what they actually are is honest. And honesty, quiet, personal, specific honesty, is one of the most powerful antidotes to emotional drain that exists. Because here's what happens when you stay invisible in your own relationships. The people around you don't know you're drowning. They genuinely don't. They see the woman who manages everything and assume she's fine because she always seems fine, because she's been performing fine for so long that fine has become the only story anyone knows. When you begin gently to let something real show, when you let someone see a need or a struggle or a limit, two things happen. Some people will surprise you with their tenderness. They've been wanting to give back to you, and they just didn't know there was an opening. And some people won't, and that information, painful as it is also important. Because it tells you something true about where the reciprocity actually lives in your life and where it doesn't. And that truth, however uncomfortable, is more useful to you than a comfortable illusion. Now I want to talk about something that gets misunderstood almost every time it comes up: rest. Not rest as a reward. Not rest you've earned by finishing everything on the list. Because that list never gets finished, as you well know. Rest as a non-negotiable. Rest as a practice. Rest as an act of profound self-respect in a culture that has spent a very long time telling women that their worth is tied to their productivity. For many women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, the idea of genuine rest carries a low hum of guilt that's almost impossible to turn off. You sit down and immediately think of the thing you should be doing. You take a quiet hour and feel vaguely irresponsible. You try to simply be, without purpose, without output, without attending to anyone. And it feels strange and uncomfortable and somehow wrong. That discomfort is not a moral signal. It's a conditioned response. It's decades of messaging that told you stillness is laziness, that ease is indulgence, that a good woman is always moving, always available, always productive. And you absorbed that messaging so thoroughly it now lives in your body as guilt. But the body knows what the guilt tries to override. Your body has been asking for rest for years. In the fatigue that doesn't lift. In the illnesses that come on whenever you slow down. Because slowing down is the only time your body finally gets permission to process everything you've been pushing through. In the way you feel sometimes, standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, like you could just stand there for an hour, and it would be the most nourishing thing you've done all week. Give yourself that hour. Not someday. Not after everything is handled. As a regular, protected, unapologetic part of how you live. And I want to distinguish real rest from distraction. Because scrolling through a phone for 2 hours is not rest, even though it feels passive. Watching television while mentally cataloging tomorrow's tasks is not rest. Real rest is something that returns you to yourself. For some women, it's silence and stillness. For others, it's walking somewhere beautiful and letting the beauty just land on them without analyzing it. For others, it's reading something absorbing, or tending a garden, or sitting with a cup of tea and doing absolutely nothing else at all. It's whatever makes the noise quiet down and lets you feel, even briefly, like you're inhabiting your own life instead of servicing it. Find that thing, protect it like it matters, because it does. There is something else I want to say, and it comes from a place I hold very carefully. Many women in this season of life are navigating grief. Not always the grief with a name and a date, though that too, and it is heavy. But the quieter griefs. The grief of a marriage that became more functional than intimate over the years. The grief of children who grew into adults with their own lives and their own distances. The grief of the body changing in ways that feel like small betrayals. The grief of looking in the mirror and catching a flash of your mother's face and realizing time is moving faster than you meant to let it. These griefs don't always get acknowledged because they're not attached to a single loss. They're cumulative. They're the kind of sadness that lives in between things, in the quiet moments, in the threshold spaces, in the particular ache of a Sunday afternoon that doesn't have anywhere to put itself. If you're carrying that kind of grief, and I suspect many of you are, I want you to know that it deserves the same tender attention as any other loss. You don't need a dramatic reason to grieve. The slow, unwitnessed losses of a life well lived but not always fully chosen deserve to be honored, sat with, perhaps even wept over, in the privacy of your own honest heart. Grief, when it's allowed to move, moves through. It's grief that's been dammed up, pushed aside, told it has no right to exist. That grief becomes part of the weight, becomes part of the drain. So if it needs to surface, let it surface. If it needs tears, let there be tears. You are not falling apart. You are finally, carefully letting something real breathe. And now, the part of this conversation I want to close with. Because everything we've talked about, the drain, the patterns, the invisible forces, the slow path back, all of it leads here. To this question, the one that sits underneath everything else, who are you, when nobody needs anything from you? I want you to not answer too quickly. Let that question settle. Because for many women, the first response is a kind of blankness, a pause that goes on longer than expected. And that pause is not a failure. It is actually the beginning of something. Because in that pause, underneath the blankness, there are quiet whispers of an answer. Old loves that got set aside somewhere. A creative impulse, a curiosity, a place you always wanted to go, a version of yourself you remember from before all the responsibilities stacked up. She's there. She didn't leave. She just got very, very quiet while you were busy holding everything together. Part of the walk back to yourself is beginning to listen for those whispers again. Not with urgency. Not with a grand plan to reinvent everything by Tuesday. Just with a gentle, open attention. What actually interests you? Not what you're supposed to be interested in, not what would be useful or productive or impressive. What genuinely, privately, quietly interests you. What makes you lose track of time in a way that feels good rather than depleting. What conversations make you feel alive instead of emptied. What kind of company actually restores you. What does your idea of a beautiful day look like when you design it entirely for yourself? These are not frivolous questions. They are the questions of a woman reclaiming her own inner life. And reclaiming your inner life, insisting on the reality and the importance of your own experience, your own desires, your own joy, is the deepest, most lasting antidote to emotional drain that I know. You came to this conversation carrying something. I don't know exactly what shape it takes for you. Every woman's exhaustion has its own particular texture, its own history, its own cast of characters. But I know you came carrying it because women who aren't carrying something don't find themselves drawn into conversations about the weight we carry. And I want to leave you with this. You have spent so much of your life being essential to other people. You have been the sanctuary for so many. The safe place, the steady presence, the one who shows up and keeps showing up no matter what. That is not a small thing. That is a genuinely beautiful way to have moved through this world. But a sanctuary needs tending too. The walls need care. The quiet inside needs to be protected. The one who holds the space for everyone else also deserves a space where she is held. You deserve that. Not in theory, not someday, not once everything is sorted and everyone is okay. Now, as you are, in all your complexity and tiredness and love and grief and quiet, still burning life. You are worth the same tenderness you have given so freely to everyone else. And the walk back to yourself, however long it takes, however many times you have to choose it again, is one of the most worthwhile journeys you will ever take. Come home to yourself. You've been missed.